Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher, theologian, and writer, is widely regarded as one of the most influential thinkers of the 19th century. His works often grapple with existential and religious themes, examining the complex relationship between the individual, faith, and society. One of his most significant and provocative texts is Fear and Trembling, first published in the year 1843 under the pseudonym Johannes de Silentio. The book deals with the biblical story of Abraham and the divine command for him to sacrifice his son Isaac. Kierkegaard uses this story to explore the nature of faith, ethics, and the individual's relationship with God. In this philosophical treatise, he seeks to address the tension between religious duty and ethical responsibility, as well as the paradox of faith in a world filled with doubt. The context of Fear and Trembling. To better understand Fear and Trembling, it is essential to consider the historical and intellectual context in which it was written. Kierkegaard lived during a period of religious and philosophical upheaval in Europe, as the Enlightenment ideals of reason and progress gave way to more subjective forms of thought. Danish society, in particular, was deeply influenced by the state-established church, which adhered to a form of Christianity that Kierkegaard deemed overly conventional and shallow. He believed that true faith required a personal, inward relationship with God, one that transcended societal expectations and rational understanding. Kierkegaard's writing sought to address this spiritual crisis by reintroducing the concept of the leap of faith, which he regarded as essential to authentic Christianity. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard uses the biblical story of Abraham to illustrate the complexities of faith. Abraham, a patriarch of the Bible, is commanded by God to sacrifice his son Isaac as a test of his devotion. This command, which seems to defy ethical reasoning and moral sense, places Abraham in an excruciating position. He must choose between his love for his son and his obedience to God. For Kierkegaard, this moment represents the ultimate expression of faith, an act that transcends reason and ethics. Abraham's willingness to obey God, even in the face of such an incomprehensible command, is the embodiment of the leap of faith that Kierkegaard believes every individual must take. The concept of the leap of faith. At the heart of Fear and Trembling lies the idea of the leap of faith, which Kierkegaard contrasts with the ethical or rational approach to life. In Kierkegaard's view, faith is not something that can be rationally justified or understood within the confines of human logic. Instead, faith requires a personal commitment to the absurd, an act of trusting in God despite the apparent contradiction of reason. This leap is not a gradual process of logical reasoning but rather a sudden, unconditional surrender to the divine. The idea of the leap of faith can be difficult to grasp, particularly in modern contexts where rationality and logic dominate our worldview. However, for Kierkegaard, faith is not simply belief in a set of doctrines or religious truths, it is an existential commitment that defies human understanding. In the case of Abraham, his willingness to sacrifice his son demonstrates the paradoxical nature of faith. A believer must surrender their earthly attachments and embrace a relationship with God that goes beyond reason. Kierkegaard's emphasis on the leap of faith suggests that true religious commitment requires a personal and inward experience. Faith is not a matter of conforming to societal norms or religious rituals, rather, it is an individual journey that involves confronting the tension between the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal, the night of faith. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard introduces the concept of the night of faith, which refers to an individual who is able to make the leap of faith and live a life of unwavering devotion to God. The knight of faith is not someone who simply conforms to societal expectations or religious norms but rather an individual who transcends the ethical order and acts according to a higher divine command. This figure is characterized by an intense inwardness and personal relationship with God, which leads them to make decisions that defy conventional logic and ethics. Kierkegaard contrasts the knight of faith with the knight of infinite resignation, who also demonstrates great spiritual commitment but does so by renouncing worldly attachments. The knight of infinite resignation, like Abraham, must confront the despair and anguish of being separated from the finite world. However, unlike the knight of faith, the knight of infinite resignation does not take the further step of trusting in God's promise. The knight of faith is willing to accept the paradox of faith, believing that God can reconcile the infinite and the finite, the impossible and the possible. For Kierkegaard, the knight of faith represents the highest form of religious existence, one that requires both courage and humility. This individual does not act out of selfish desire or ethical obligation but rather out of an absolute devotion to God. The knight of faith embodies the paradox of Christian existence, where belief in the absurd is the path to true freedom and redemption, the ethical and the religious. One of the key themes in Fear and Trembling is the tension between the ethical and the religious. Kierkegaard uses Abraham's story to highlight the conflict between the individual's duty to uphold ethical norms and the requirement to obey God's command. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son represents a radical choice that goes beyond the ethical sphere, challenging the conventional moral understanding of right and wrong. This tension, according to Kierkegaard, is at the heart of religious existence. The ethical realm, in Kierkegaard's philosophy, is the domain of human responsibility, where individuals are bound by universal moral laws. These laws govern human relationships and ensure social order. In contrast, the religious sphere is characterized by a direct relationship with God, one that transcends the ethical order. The individual who enters into this relationship may be called upon to act in ways that seem to contradict ethical norms. For Abraham, this means being willing to sacrifice his son in obedience to God, even though this act would normally be considered morally wrong. Kierkegaard suggests that true faith requires the individual to be willing to forsake ethical considerations in favor of obedience to God. This does not mean that ethics are unimportant, rather, it underscores the idea that faith is not always compatible with human reason or moral reasoning. In moments of divine command, the religious individual must make a choice that goes beyond the ethical, trusting that God's will is ultimately greater than human understanding. The paradox of faith. Kierkegaard's exploration of faith in Fear and Trembling is deeply tied to the concept of the paradox. For him, faith is inherently paradoxical because it involves belief in the absurd, the idea that God could command something that contradicts human reason and ethics. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac represents the paradox of faith. How can one reconcile the demands of a loving God with the command to commit such an appalling act? The paradox of faith is not just a theological puzzle for Kierkegaard, it is a fundamental aspect of human existence. Faith, for him, is not something that can be easily understood or explained. It requires an acceptance of the absurd, a willingness to trust in the divine even when it defies all logic. This paradox is what makes faith both challenging and transformative. It requires the individual to step beyond the limitations of human understanding and enter into a relationship with God that is defined by trust and surrender. In this sense, Kierkegaard's philosophy challenges individuals to confront the limits of human reason and embrace a more profound and mysterious form of existence. Faith, for Kierkegaard, is not about certainty or knowledge but about trust in the face of uncertainty. In Fear and Trembling, Søren Kierkegaard offers a profound exploration of faith, ethics, and the human condition. By focusing on the story of Abraham, he highlights the tension between reason and faith, the ethical and the religious, and the paradoxical nature of belief. Abraham's willingness to obey God, even when faced with an incomprehensible command, represents the ultimate expression of faith. For Kierkegaard, true faith requires a personal and inward relationship with God, one that transcends societal norms and rational understanding. Through the concept of the leap of faith and the figure of the knight of faith, Kierkegaard invites readers to confront the complexities of religious existence and to embrace the paradoxes that define it. His work challenges individuals to take a leap into the unknown, to trust in God even when it seems irrational, and to find meaning in the face of uncertainty. Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling remains a foundational text in existential philosophy and theology, offering timeless insights into the nature of faith and the human search for meaning.